Welcome everyone. This is the Global Business School Network Cross-Border Coffee Break on Leading Global Change, which will be presented by Dr. Ted Cross of Thunderbird School of Global Management at Arizona State University. My name is Fabienne Jolivet. I'm the Executive Director of GBSN, and I am pleased to be facilitating today's presentation. Dr. Ted Cross is the Clinical Assistant Professor of Leadership and Management, as well as the Director of the Master of Applied Leadership and Management program at the Thunderbird School of Global Management at Arizona State University. Welcome, Ted.
Thank you.
Before we get started, I want to let everyone know that you are all on mute. If you're interested in submitting a question, you are welcome to do so by clicking on the Q&A icon on the lower right-hand side of your screen and typing in your question and submitting it. You're also welcome to submit a question at any point of the presentation. You won't be disturbing the presentation, and you can also send questions on an anonymously basis. Our agenda today consists of 3 sections. I will first give an overview, a very brief overview of the Global Business School Network before passing it on to Dr. Cross, who will be giving his insights on leading global change. Dr. Cross will touch upon the fear of globalization, the different change models, as well as the barriers to change and how to overcome them. We will then have a 10 to 15 minute Q&A session whereby I will be facilitating and reading the questions out to Dr. Cross, who will answer as many as possible. The questions we're not able to get to today, we will make sure that Dr. Cross is able to type in a document that we will then email to everyone. And just so everyone is aware as well, we are live on Facebook today and we'll be posting this recording on the website as well. So very briefly, GBSN, the Global Business School Network, is a membership organization of 73 business schools representing 40 countries. We are a platform of business schools, and our mission is to improve access to quality, locally relevant management education for the developing world. We do so by providing a platform for networking and partnerships. We also do a lot of promotion of best practice, and we implement capacity building programs. We welcome you to get more information by visiting our website, gbsn.org. And on this note, I am happy to pass this on to Dr. Ted Cross, who will then start the presentation on leading global change. All yours.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be with everyone today. I'm very excited to talk a little bit about leading global change and how do we overcome some of the barriers of global change, and how do we as leaders think about change from a systematic perspective and from an individual perspective. When people hear about globalization, they really get nervous that they're going to lose their jobs, that the economy is going to get bad. And that's really because globalization has an image problem. Over the last 40 to 50 years, we've had tremendous success with globalization, but people are still very fearful of it. And one of the reasons is because when they hear globalization, they think about losing their jobs, identities, and wealth. So it's not just that they're worried about their jobs going away, it's also that it might take away part of their identity through their job. And so globalization can be very scary for people. But one of the things I want to get across in the first section of this presentation is that we overestimate the bad things that are happening because of globalization, and we underestimate the good things that are happening because of globalization. You might have seen a lot of headlines about the bad things. Here's one from US News and World Report, Failures of Globalization. This is a full report that goes on to talk about the inequalities that have been created through the globalization movement over the last 40 years. And you might have heard about some people in some sectors losing jobs, different sectors suffering, different countries suffering from globalization. And I'm not here to say that globalization doesn't have some downsides. No doubt that some jobs and some industries in some places have and will suffer due to globalization. I think we all know people who have had jobs displaced or outsourced, or sectors that have been outsourced. And as that begins to happen, there are certain factions of people that will feel disproportionately negative effects of globalization. However, we overestimate how truly global we are, as far as being connected globally. And so I like to point out some statistics from a report from an NYU researcher. He did a full research report and found that only about 3% of all phone calls made in the world each year are international. So we're more connected than ever through technology, yet we're not making international calls overall. So we're not connecting with other people in other countries. Also, only 10% of all investments in the world each year are made across borders. Now, why is this important? One of the big fears of globalization is that money will leave one country in the form of an investment into the investment into another country and sort of vacate the previous country. Now, this NYU researcher found that only 10% of all investments every year are going across borders. And because of that, I think we're overestimating the impact of foreign investment. You know, we worry about, for example, here in the US, that maybe the Chinese or the Canadians are buying up too much real estate. And that may be the case, but it's probably less problematic than we think. Another interesting, and this was my favorite fact, is that less than 10% of people's friends on Facebook live in a different country. So again, we're able to connect with people from all over the world, yet we don't. We have very few friends. Now, the group that I'm talking to now, you all, this audience, probably have a much higher percentage than that, and so do I. But in general, most people are not connecting with others in other countries. So the first thing is that we are really overestimating, number one, the pervasiveness of globalization as far as the micro level of interpersonal effects, so how we connect to each other on a one-to-one basis. And we're also overestimating the macro effects, the negative components of international globalization and trade. But there's a lot of good things that we also underestimate about globalization. For example, here's one researcher who found that in 1990, 23% of the world's population was middle class. Today, 40%, 45% are rather. So we've had this huge jump in the percentage of middle class categorization across the world because of globalization and international trade. Now, even here locally, where I sit in Phoenix, Arizona, 1 in 5 jobs is tied to global trade. So it's not like on the macro level, we can't get away from globalization. On the micro level, we're overestimating its effects. On the macro level, it is very pervasive and is creating mostly positive effects. Now, we can debate about some of the negative sides of the macro situation also. But one thing that really has been part of our story here at Thunderbird is that if we can rely on each other through international trade and globalization, it can also create peacekeeping. One of our famous first presidents here at Thunderbird, he was the one who came up with this quote: "Borders frequented by trade seldom need soldiers." And this is the idea that after World War II, that if we increase international trade and we relied on each other as trade partners, we would be less likely to go to war. And so that's been another effect of globalization, is also peacekeeping through the interconnectedness and interdependentness of working with each other. Now, one other thing, this is sort of the turning point of where I want to get to from. We've talked a little bit about some of the downsides of globalization. We've talked about some of the upsides of globalization. And now here's a quote from our former Dean and President, Morrison, talking about global trade and the rapid pace of global trade. And he says the inability to adapt as fast as technology changes leaves us feeling disoriented and rudderless. And for good reason, he says. Citizens are left wondering what has happened to their country. Employees are left worrying about their career futures. So it's not just that globalization is displacing jobs or helping increase the middle class, but the negative and the positive effects of globalization in general create change. And so the core problem of why people, I believe, are really worried about globalization is because nothing symbolizes change more than globalization. And we as human beings are resistant to change in general. So now what I'd like to do is go through some of the different models that we have for change and how we might implement those in a rapidly developing and changing global environment. So the most famous change model comes from the Harvard Business School and John Kotter. Many of you already have seen this. This is Kotter's 8 steps to leading change. And you can see the 8 steps here, running through them quickly. He says you got to establish urgency, create a guiding coalition, communicate a vision, remove obstacles to get to the vision, empower others to act, and then plan for and create short-term wins, consolidate those wins, and then try to institutionalize the change culture. Now, this is an interesting model. I think it's too complicated. It has 8 steps, so I don't think it's very useful. So based on kind of this model of 8 steps, I like to follow a different model that is much more simple from Gregerson and Black over at INSEAD, and they have 3 steps. They say that the reason why people fail to change is because they fail to see, they fail to move, and they fail to finish. So we're going to talk about those today a little bit. So the first premise of Gregerson and Black is that organizational change starts with individual change. So what they're really saying is, if you look at Kotter's model or some of these other models, they are taking a very high-level organizational view, and that is important. But Gregerson and Black are arguing that if you really want to change an organization, you need to start focusing at the individual change level. So the first barrier that they identify in sort of moving change initiatives forward is that people fail to see the need to change. And here's their quote: "Fundamentally, we fail to see because we are blinded by the light of what we already see." So we fail to see that we even need to change at all, probably because we've had some success in the past, and now things have changed in the environment or internally in the organization, and it's tough to see that we actually need to make a change. So the first thing is to help people actually see the need to make a change. And one great example of this is if we go back to the early days of cell phones and cell phone technology. Motorola was the king of cell phones, especially in the analog age. Motorola was making a lot, had the market share of the cellular phones. They got word that a new company was starting to form called Nokia, and Nokia was going to do something called digital cell phone service. And Motorola kind of said, look, we're really good at this analog thing. The digital will never catch on. And so they decided to go ahead and forego going to digital for the time being. We all know what happened. Within 5 years, Nokia had the market share in the cell phone industry, and Motorola was relegated to sort of fossil or dinosaur status. Now Motorola is making a comeback, but it was out of the game for a long time because they did not see the need to change in the new environment being digital technology versus analog technology. So that's an example of creating contrast. The first way that we can help people see that there is a need to change is to create what is called a burning raft. And that's why I have these flames on the right-hand side of your screen. The idea is to help people actually feel like there's a real need to change. People don't change course often unless they have to. And so the idea of the burning raft is that people won't jump off of a boat unless it's on fire. So you have to show them that it's on fire and create some contrast for them, create some urgency for them to be able to actually see the need for change. Another great example of creating contrast and change to get people to see the need for change comes from Cedars-Sinai Hospital. A number of years ago, this famous hospital was having a very interesting problem, a very problematic issue for us patients. Doctors were not washing their hands as much as they should. And this was causing some infection problems in the hospital. And so administrators set out to teach the hospital staff and doctors to wash their hands more often. They put up the hand sanitizer units all over where you could get hand sanitizer, and nothing seemed to be working. So they finally resorted to a different tactic, and this is a way to create contrast and show people the urgency. They had all the doctors in a meeting, and they had them come up and press their hands into a petri dish, different hands in different dishes, and then they cultured those petri dishes to show the bacteria that grew from their impressions of their hands. Then they took those photos of the actual the pictures of the hands, the impressions that had grown the bacteria, and they plastered them all over on flyers all over the hospital, and also as screensavers on the different computers at Cedars-Sinai. And this helped turn around the behavior because it made visible an invisible problem. So it made visible an invisible problem. So one of the ways to help people see the need to change is often to make it visual. And in this way, they actually showed the bacteria that was being spread from the hands of the doctors and had the impressions from the petri dishes, put those into the computer screensavers and on flyers, and no one could avoid confronting the fact that this was a problem, and behaviors began to change. The second sort of problem or barrier to change initiatives is that even after people see the need to change, they might see that they need to do something, they often fail to move. And we've all experienced this in our lives, right? We know that we need to get on a better workout schedule, for example, or we need to get on a better diet, and we know we need to do it. We see the need for change, and we don't actually move. And this is often because the new right thing is hard. So we're asking people to actually do new behaviors, try new initiatives, and we're not very good at the new things. So we're asking people not only to abandon their old behaviors that they were pretty good at, we're also asking them to adopt new behaviors that they're not good at. And that doesn't sit well with people. And so there's this great saying, the old right thing is now the new wrong thing. And let me say that again, the old right thing becomes the new wrong thing. So I might have had lots of success in the past operating in one way, and now a change initiative is started in my organization, or there's a need for a change personally in my life, and now I need to adopt new behaviors and new systems. And this is hard because old habits die hard. Have you ever, for example, changed jobs or moved your apartment or house, and suddenly you're driving to work or to home, and you end up at the wrong place? You end up at the old house, or you end up at the old place of work? That's because your mind went on autopilot and you were driving along and you weren't thinking deliberately about it, and you were suddenly at the wrong place. That's an example of how habits die hard because they are emblazoned in our brains, and we find these mental shortcuts rather than thinking through deliberately things each day. And so we're asking people to change behaviors that are ingrained. And one way to actually get them to move is to translate our vision, so the reason why we need to change, so that contrast, translate that vision into specific goals, then translate those goals into actions that are specific tasks, and then further down, make sure that systematically we are rewarding the new behaviors that lead to the new outcomes. So in this phase, one place that, one thing that often happens that derails change initiatives is that we might be able to connect the vision to goals to actions, but the system that we have set up might reward old behaviors. So if, for example, we're taking that Nokia example where we need to change as Motorola from analog to digital rather, that would require a change in behavior of accepting external criticisms and accepting new information from the outside rather than just being a closed system of experts. And so we need to make sure that a system would be set up that would reward those kinds of behaviors rather than saying, no, we're Motorola and we only accept sort of the research that comes out of our shop, and we only accept our experts and we don't listen to outside experts. So we need to make sure the system is actually set up in a way that is conducive to rewarding the new behaviors. Now, the last barrier, after we help people to see there's a need to change, we help them begin to move towards their goals through the action items. The last one is the failure to finish. So we often fail to finish or follow through, if you want to call it that. And one of the main reasons is because the finish line looks so far away. Now we have a new goal, we have new behaviors, and the finish line seems very far away and it's demotivating. I remember when I was a kid, my dad loved to do mountain biking, so he'd often take us kids mountain biking with him in the mountains. And one time we went on a mountain bike ride with my dad and his friend, and pretty soon we got lost. And my dad didn't quite tell us that we were lost at first, but pretty soon it was getting longer and longer that we weren't finding our way, and we were lost out in the woods with our bikes. And it took us a very long time to kind of find our way back to the trail and get back to where we were going. And I remember distinctly that I was so tired as I must have been, I think, 12 years old or something like that. I was so tired that at one point I was just pushing my bike along. I wasn't riding it anymore. And then pretty soon my dad was pushing my bike for me. And then, I was very tired, and this bike ride was going on for hours. And suddenly we came through the trees and we came upon the road that led to our house. And I knew it was the road that led to our house. And I had a burst of energy, and I jumped on my bike and I rode all the way home and left my dad and his friend behind. And I remember my dad saying later how interesting it was that when I could see the house and the road to the house, that I was off and running and got home very soon with a new burst of energy. Now, this is what we need to do for our employees. We need to make sure that as we are leading change initiatives, that we make reinforcement close. In other words, we need to move up the finish line to where people can see it as a realistic goal, an attainable goal, because they'll be more motivated. Now, maybe the end finish line is very far away, but we can also create smaller interim finish lines or checkpoints where people can look to a closer finish line than a longer one. And as they reach those shorter ones, they become more motivated to move on to the next checkpoint. So the authors, Gregerson and Black, say, look, proximate factors change people's behavior significantly more than distant factors. In other words, make reinforcement right up front, right close to in time and in space, so that people can have feedback that is in a reasonable loop rather than a very long loop. Bring that finish line forward. Now, one of the other things we need to make sure that we do as we help people move through the finish line is that we need to make sure that we enlist reinforcement. So on the left-hand side of your screen, you see a bunch of people gathering. As you're leading change initiatives, you need to find those influencers within the organization, make sure that you can convert them to your change initiative, have them evangelize to others because you can't do it all on your own. And then on the right-hand side of your screen, make sure they are armed with data so that when people ask them questions, they'll be able to answer those in an intelligent manner and be able to be confident in what they're saying and help you move the change initiative along. Now, what we've done is gone through some basic ideas of organizational change. We started off talking about John Kotter's 8-step model, and then we moved into the Gregerson and Black model and looked at how do we move through the barriers of the failure to see, the failure to move, and the failure to finish. One other example that I would like to give is a number of years ago, HP, Hewlett-Packard, the company, the computer company, and also they make a lot of printers and these kinds of accessories that go along with computing. They were having a problem at their factory because they were making these really nice printers, but one of the engineers got together with one of the manufacturing managers, and they figured out that if they reduced the thickness of the plastic around the case of a printer, they could save a lot of money. But they were having a very hard time convincing the engineering team that they should do so. So they would go to these meetings with engineers and they would say, we need to reduce the thickness of plastic. It'll save us a lot of money. And the engineers would say, no, we like the thick plastic. We think it's higher quality. And so the change initiative would sort of stop right there, and nothing would happen. No changes would be made. So eventually this manufacturing manager decided to try to create some contrast, as we talked about in the failure to see category. And so what he did is he had all of the engineers come into a meeting. He had one of the printers, one of these very nice sturdy printers made out of thick plastic. He put the printer in the middle of the room. And as he put it in the middle of the room, he gathered everyone around him. And then he stood on top of the printer and discussed why he thought they should reduce costs by making the plastic of the printer less thick. And it really helped create an image to everyone. He said, look, we don't need printers that can serve as a step stool or that someone can stand on, right? We don't need them to be that sturdy. What we need is quality printers. And so he proposed that they reduce the thickness of the plastic. And finally, when everyone could see, yes, it probably was overkill to have such a sturdy printer, they were able to go ahead and reduce the thickness and reduce costs at the same time. So there's lots of ways that you can help people begin to see. There's lots of ways you can help people start to move through the change process and help people to finish as they're moving through this process. Another thing that I wanted to finish off with is talking a little bit about thinking about change initiatives as a systems approach. So it's not just that that change happens on an individual basis. Yes, we've talked about starting with the individual, but it also happens within a system. And what I mean by system is that we need to think about an organization as an organism. That's one of the reasons why organization and organism have the same root. They're meant to be sort of these living and changing things. And because they're living and changing things, we have to make sure that we're taking a systems approach. Now, what do I mean by systems approach? The best example of a systems approach is to make sure that as you move one thing in the organization, you wait enough time to see how it affects other parts of the organization. I remember a number of years ago, I was down in Brazil, and I was at a very nice hotel, and I turned on the hot water. And as I turned on the hot water in the faucet, it seemed cold. And so I turned it hotter and hotter, and all of a sudden it came out really hot. Now what had happened was that I hadn't given the system enough time to catch up to actually get the hot water through. I just kept turning the dial more and more. And often that's what we do in change initiatives. If the needle doesn't seem to be moving at the beginning, we will often just keep cranking it up or changing more things and changing more things. So we need to make sure as we're moving through these steps that we're giving enough time to see how things are moving along and how it interferes with or positively affects other parts of the organization. Now, if you like these kinds of ideas that I've been talking about, as was mentioned earlier, I am the director of an online Master of Applied Leadership and Management here at the Thunderbird School of Global Management. It's 30 credits. It's an online format with optional in-person experiences. And we cover these kinds of topics like leading change, global negotiations, cross-cultural communications, global finance and marketing, and those kinds of courses. I'm glad to answer some questions now, but I'll turn the time over to Fabian for those questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Quast. This was very interesting and very timely and relevant as well. So let me just make sure that I am able to get to the Q&A part and make sure that we address as many questions as possible.
Great.
And of course, the ones that we are not able to get to, we'll make sure that you have them and that we can communicate to participants once we're done. Number one question, which is a question that I should have answered myself actually, will we be able to get the slides of the session after the presentation? And it's a very easy question. The answer is yes. We will make sure to have those slides available to all the participants. And what we will do as well is upload the video as well as the presentation slides on our website as well. So please make sure to check our website, and if you don't receive an email from us, but you should receive an email and also be able to check our website for the slides and the recording of this presentation. So, Dr. Quast, what advice would you give to small organizations, less than 10 people, who are going through change and balancing the day-to-day with doing the big picture change?
That's a great question. Smaller teams have advantages and disadvantages in change initiatives. The advantage, of course, is there's less people to convince to the change initiative. And the disadvantage can be that often it can take longer to create changes because there's less organizational inertia and capacity to actually make those changes. As far as balancing sort of the big picture with the day-to-day things that you need to do, one of the most important things to actually drive change is to make sure that the overall big picture change initiative aligns really well with the day-to-day tasks. So that goes into that phase where we talked about failing to move. And so if we can make the larger vision connected to the day-to-day activities, we'll be more likely to actually achieve them. Now, the other thing that I'll mention for small and big organizations, but particularly for smaller organizations, is there are now ways to implement technology to help reinforce some of these new behaviors that we're incentivizing. So it might be through, a system like Asana or a project management system that you might use that actually helps reinforce the tasks that you'd like people to do. It could even be a CRM system like Salesforce that you're using. But if you employ technology, it can often help magnify a small organization or a small staff's ability to follow through on the larger change initiatives. But in general, we need to make sure that we are connecting the big picture change initiatives directly to those day-to-day things. And if the day-to-day things don't connect to the larger change initiative, it'll never get off the ground.
Excellent. And in your experience, how many short-term finish lines are too many for a larger organization?
Yeah, that's a great question. Sometimes there is too many short-term goals. I often like to think about, the larger change initiative, if this is something organization-wide, could take a number of years to complete. And so you want to break those down into short-term objectives that are much shorter, maybe 6 months as a finish line. As far as how many actual short-term finish lines can you have, it really depends on what initiative you're trying to move along and the organization that you're in. But what I would say is at least try to have people have tasks that they can complete on a daily basis that roll up into larger objectives on a weekly basis, a monthly basis, and a quarterly basis. And if all those different tasks are aligned That can help people have shorter feedback loops. So you're chunking out the tasks. So they're doing one small behavior each day that helps them build towards a goal for the week, that helps them build towards a goal for the month and then the quarter, for example. And as we can sort of create those mini goals, those create smaller finish lines. And so I think that it's often important to think about things, yes, from a daily and a weekly basis, and then have those rolling into actual finish lines that are monthly and quarterly.
Excellent. And can you give advice on how to identify those influencers within your organization to engage in your change initiative?
Yeah, it's a great question. Identifying influencers is very important. One thing that you can rely on is called a sociogram. You can look that up. A sociogram is a way of mapping out the different relationships between people in an organization. And basically, it's a formalized way of looking at who are the ones who control the most influence in the organization, irrespective of positional power. So often we know that sometimes that people who are in the leadership positions that have the titles, they're often not the most influential people in the organization. It might be people who have been at the organization for a long time, that don't have leadership titles, that have a lot of influence. And so one way to sort of start finding out who these influencers are is to do sort of what I would call a qualitative research project. You need to go out and talk with a bunch of employees and find out which names keep coming up over and over again as you're asking about who are the people that they go to for questions to be answered, who are the ones that who opinions they respect the most. And as you begin to interview lots of people, similar names will come up over and over again. And then you can sort of hone in on those maybe handful of people who are the core influencers in the organization.
Great. And here's another great question, Dr. Cross. For organizations that work across borders, can you talk a bit about how best to implement a change initiative across the organization when there are offices located in different countries?
Yes, this is more and more
common.
An issue that we have to deal with, right? I mean, right now we're doing a webinar. We often have distributed workforces that we need to work with. So one thing is there is no substitute for actually getting on the ground and meeting with teams. It doesn't have to be as frequent as we think, but I think that there is some real value, and especially at the beginning of a change movement, to be on the ground and sort of understand that office that's going to be working at a distance for you, how they operate, what cultural nuances there might be, and then to enroll the change sort of leaders in that office. So for example, Thunderbird has an office in Moscow. If I were working on a change initiative there, I would make sure that our head of training over there was really bought into the change initiative, and that as I spoke with her, she could help me translate any of the sort of short-term goals that we've been talking about into appropriate office context. So just because one thing seems to work really well in our office doesn't mean it would work really well in Moscow, but we might be able to get the same result by asking the people there how they might get to the result we want and then implement different tasks. So what I would say is, one, don't substitute FaceTime for just virtual time, especially at the beginning. And second, make sure that you're enrolling locals in that office who will be able to help you navigate the cultural nuances.
Great. To be mindful of time, we will take 2 or 3 more questions.
Sure.
One question is about external stakeholders. Could you talk a little about communicating your change process to external stakeholders without sounding alarm bells?
Yeah, so you don't want to alarm your board of directors, for example, that things are going south, right? And there's a huge need for change. So in that failure to see section, I talked about creating sort of contrast. And it doesn't always have to be, hey, there's a contrast or there's this huge problem and that's why we need to change. You can also frame it in a story to external stakeholders as an opportunity for further growth or expansion. So let's go back to the Nokia Motorola example. Motorola could have talked to their board and said, look, there's this new technology that's being developed, and I think that we can get a greater market share if we adopt this new technology, and framed the story and change initiative in that framework rather than, hey, Nokia is going to eat our lunch and take all of our business, which would be the negative way to frame that. Now, sometimes you have to use both. To the question at hand, is probably wiser for external stakeholders to frame it in the positive direction. And you can take any sort of negative problem that might be the impetus for change and reframe it as an opportunity.
Great. And what would you say would be the best way to show employees or team the impact or progress your change initiative is achieving? Sometimes they can't see progress happening and motivation levels decrease.
Yep. Most of the work that we all do in this, knowledge economy or the fourth industrial revolution is not visible. I had somebody, one of my coworkers said their daughter asked them what they do at work all day. And he tried to explain to her, and then he overheard his daughter talking to someone else. And they were asking, what does your dad do for work? And his daughter said, well, he sits in an office and he answers emails, right? And so sometimes it is pretty hard to explain what progress we're making. I think that data visualization is key to helping our followers, our workers, our employees, our colleagues be able to see the progress we're making in the change initiative. So this means regularly on a weekly basis, showing people the progress towards our goals in a visual manner. I become a huge fan of creating internal infographics that can be updated regularly. I think it's more and more important to employ people who have digital design acumen or data visualization skills to be able to take big data, boil it down into simple graphics that we can show progress over time. If we can distribute those on a regular basis, and like I said, it doesn't have to be that complicated. At first, there's front loading because you got to create these reports, you got to create these infographics, but then you can update them on a weekly basis. And as you do so, you can create a sort of dashboard mentality and culture in the organization where people can see the changes and see the actual results of their efforts.
Excellent. And we have reached a time limit. Thank you very much, Dr.
Of course.
For your time and for such a great presentation. Again, change is something very relevant and constant in our lives. This was very insightful. And thank you to everyone who attended the presentation today. We'll make sure to share the Q&A documents with you as well as the PowerPoint. And we welcome you to visit our website so you can make sure to check out our next cross-border coffee break, which will happen next week. Again, thank you so much again, Dr. Cross, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.